We are live. Yeah, I can see the attendee count going up already. Hi, friends. Welcome to Be Wastewise. I am Shweta Bandapani. I'm one of the community builders on Be Wastewise. The topic of today's webinar is US policy updates for the waste industry. This is actually a two-part series. The first one is now, and the second one is going to happen in June. In today's webinar, the team, we have Cole Rosengren, the managing editor of Manufacturing Dive, Packaging Dive, and Waste Dive, Megan Quinn, senior reporter at Waste Dive, and Jacob Wallace, reporter at Waste Dive. The team at Waste Dive essentially will discuss climate and PFAS policy updates today. And they're going to pivot to other things in June. Before I'm going to hand it over to Cole, I just have a request from Be Wastewise to all our attendees, especially if you've been folks who've attended our webinars in the past. We're currently collecting feedback from our community about how we're doing and how we can help you more. So I'm dropping a link to that. Please share your feedback with us. It'll be most helpful for us, both in terms of building out offerings that we're going to create in the future, as well as representing what we've done so far. So please share your feedback here. And that's pretty much it. Over to you, Cole. Let's start the webinar.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to Be Wastewise for hosting. We always appreciate partnering with your group here. As Wade said, we're with Waste Dive. For folks who may not be familiar, we are a business news publication about the U.S. solid waste and recycling industry. We do follow Canada to some degree as well, but we'll be focusing on the U.S. today. And as I'm sure folks have been following in the news, a lot of changes happening at the federal level when it comes to environmental policy, brought about by the new presidential administration, the second term for President Donald Trump that started last year. As is expected, you often see changes in federal policy with the new federal administration, and this time even more so than usual, quite a bit of changes happening. We'll largely be focusing on changes at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency today. May mention a couple other agencies, but that's the main focus and largely where a lot of the relevant regulation happens for the solid waste and recycling industry. We spoke about this a bit last year in a webinar here as well, but just as a reminder for folks, the EPA has a new administrator, Lee Zeldin. He came from a political background in New York and has been enacting a lot of changes that were promised in the second Trump term. Their broader push is what they call deregulation, less regulation at the federal level, putting it more to the state level, and actively trying to reverse a lot of the policies that were in place under the Biden and Obama administrations. With that in mind, we're going to be focusing, as we just said, on greenhouse gas emissions and PFAS today. The first half of our discussion will be more on greenhouse gas emissions, second half more on PFAS. We welcome you to put questions in the Q&A function here, and I'll watch them as we go. We'll try to take them topically focused, but any broader questions, if we have time, we're glad to take those at the end as well. And we'll also put the team email address in the chat here at the end, and we're always very glad to hear from you. So to start it off, we're going to go to you, Jacob, who does most of our greenhouse gas reporting. Speaking broadly, what has changed under the second Trump term when it comes to regulating greenhouse gas emissions, thinking about changes to the endangerment finding as well as the greenhouse gas reporting program?
Right. So there's been a lot of foundational changes that have happened at the EPA over the past year. As Cole mentioned, the EPA is taking what they call a deregulatory approach to wide swath of emissions, including how they're addressing climate. So the endangerment finding is sort of the key to this. It was a 2009 decision that the US EPA made following a court ruling where they had to decide whether climate change causing emissions are significantly harming the general public. So with that determination, they were able to begin regulating those emissions under the Clean Air Act. So that's been the law of the land for over a decade now. But last year, the EPA decided to review the endangerment finding, and then through a independent commission, it kind of stood up to look things over. It decided that the endangerment finding was not accurate, and as a result, they are not obligated to regulate climate warming emissions under the Clean Air Act. So that, again, is the underpinning for most of the regulations that we see for things like carbon dioxide and methane gases. The waste industry is, as we know, a major contributor to climate change emissions in the United States. It's one of the largest contributors of methane, especially. There are some quirks to the regulations for the industry, though. The main rules that we see for landfills, for instance, are actually explicitly tailored around non-methane organic compounds, which means not climate warming emissions. So as a result, we don't expect those regulations to be affected significantly by the change to the federal government's approach to climate change, but we're still expecting to see some changes there. The other big thing that affects the waste industry when it comes to the EPA's regulation of climate change is the greenhouse gas reporting program. So that's a program that's been around for over a decade, and it essentially requires industrial facilities above a certain size to report their greenhouse gas emissions. So that applies to manufacturing facilities, all kinds of industrial facilities. It also applies to incinerators and landfills. The EPA has essentially tried to wind down that program. Now, obviously, there are legal challenges involved with this, but they have already extended the deadline by which facilities have to report their emissions to the greenhouse gas reporting program. For the previous year, the deadline is now in October. It was originally supposed to be in March, actually. So we're seeing that program potentially get wound down as well, which means less federal data on greenhouse gas emissions from the industry. It's interesting because there are some cases where there are voices within the waste sector that are saying, this is going to be the loss of data that could be useful for us in terms of things like carbon credits and, other ways in which tracking, data across the industry is useful for greenhouse gas emissions. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, as I said, for right now, that the rollback of some of those climate change rules means less reporting and potentially less regulation as well.
Gotcha. We'll get to more specific waste regulations here in a minute, but wanted to ask another kind of higher level question about the agency to you, Megan. How has the agency's approach to environmental justice changed? We know that was a very big focus under the Biden EPA, different approach under the Trump EPA.
Completely different approach. So the Biden administration had really tried to formalize adding environmental justice initiatives into the EPA by creating offices specifically for the purpose of working with communities on how environmental impacts can affect communities that are in different socioeconomic statuses, are affected by different layers of types of pollution, things like that. Under the Trump administration, under his second term, that started. Those offices went away almost immediately. A lot of the federal funding that was going to be going towards grants and things like that ended up not going into play. And there are also some tools that not just the federal government used, but also states and then also just environmental groups were using to monitor environmental justice communities. The biggest one being EJ Screen, which the EPA, there was an EPA tool for being able to kind of track and monitor some of these environmental impacts on communities through data like race data, health data, socioeconomic data. EJ Screen just kind of went offline. So what happened was a lot of these kind of grassroots organizations kind of stepped in. These grassroots organizations in the US that work on environmental justice initiatives, they had been working on this stuff for a long, long time before the US EPA even created these offices. They're still doing this work today. The difference is, whether or not they have federal support to do so. So what we're seeing is, the EPA no longer has, specific environmental justice offices. Any kind of work that might have an environmental justice angle is very, the current administration doesn't really have a lot of support for that. And then also, a lot of this stuff is still happening more at the state level. So we're seeing Like New Jersey is always a great example of a state that has a really robust environmental justice law that just got held up in court, upheld in court. So we're seeing that, there's still states that have more robust environmental justice initiatives. And again, we're going to maybe be seeing some of that uh, have more traction at the state level and also at the local level again, like I said, because environmental justice at its core in the US is a grassroots initiative and effort. So, but yeah, as long as the Trump administration is still kicking, we're not going to be seeing environmental justice be a factor at all.
Right. Yeah, it is not a term they like. In fact, they seem to look for ways to, to call it out and kind of discourage it, is what we've been seeing, as along with the term climate change as well. Just pivoting to some more specific regulations we have seen for that are relevant to the waste industry here. We're going to go back to you, Jacob. There's been a number of recent finalized or proposed regulations when it comes to combusting certain material, municipal solid waste, disaster debris, as well as tires. What can you tell us on that?
Right, yes. So, for the first time in about 20 years, we have final rules for large municipal waste combustors coming from the EPA. So they just finalized those earlier this month. That's a big deal. They tightened air emission regulations on, I believe it's nine pollutants for federal permits. So, new municipal waste incinerators will have restrictions that particularly affect nitrogen oxide as well as some others. So we're going to see lower emissions on that front. And then for existing incinerators, we'll likely see them change some of their technology to address lead emissions and a couple of other pollutants as well. So that was, as I said, long in the works, but now we'll see industry start to digest those and, where needed, make upgrades to their facilities. And there are other categories of incinerators that the EPA is also tweaking its regulations to. Just as a refresher, so there's several main categories. There's large municipal waste combustors, which are the ones obviously that burn municipal waste. There are commercial and industrial solid waste incinerators. There are the other solid waste incinerators, and then there are also hazardous waste incinerators. So basically, the agency kind of divides up its regulation based on what the facility burns, as well as the technologies to a certain degree. So large municipal waste combustors, we've seen the update now, and we'll see that kind of get digested. In 2024, the EPA updated its regulations for commercial and industrial solid waste incinerators. But what it's recently proposed is to tweak some of the rules there to allow for more burning of disaster debris. This was a proposal that the EPA first telegraphed last year, and they were saying it was basically in light of Hurricane Helene and its impacts in North Carolina. Some of the communities there were having issues cleaning up the disaster debris, and so they had requested the EPA to allow them to burn more of it to, get through it quicker. And according to the Trump EPA, they were saying that the Biden EPA did not allow those communities to use incinerators for those purposes. And that basically stems from concerns about the kinds of pollutants that come from burning disaster debris, because it tends to include, things from homes and buildings that might have, dangerous chemicals or materials within them. So the EPA is now saying we want to try and allow to burn more disaster debris in those kinds of incinerators, and especially something called air curtain incinerators, which are typically used by like the Forest Service to burn like brush and things like that. So that's now a proposal that's out there and receiving comments. We might see more action on that this year. And then, as Cole mentioned as well, the agency is also looking into the possibility of burning tires as a way to deal with the large amounts of used tires that are, piled up around the country and potentially burn through those quicker, literally. So again, that's something that's a proposal, but it certainly seems to show us that the EPA under Trump and under Zeldin is, amenable to burning more materials with incinerators as a means of, dealing with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, an interesting mix of seeing, new regulations for the municipal solid waste side, but partially updating or loosening regulations for other categories. And as we know, there's also been discussion about pyrolysis, also known as chemical recycling for plastics, which we'll talk about more in our June webinar. That's another area that they're looking to change. Sticking with you, Jacob, on the landfill side, as we talked at the beginning about some of the broader, climate implications for the waste industry, what more specifically have we seen when it comes to how the CPA may or may not adjust landfill regulations? Thinking about adjustments to the Waters of the United States rule following the Supreme Court ruling, and any other pending regulations to watch there.
Right. So no surprise, deregulation is probably the order of the day. So in Waters of the United States, it's often referred to as WOTUS, just an acronym, but it's literally the words Water of the United States and the Clean Water Act and how different administrations over the years have interpreted those words. So as a refresher, in 2023, the Supreme Court had a ruling in Sackett v. EPA that essentially rolled back federal protections over certain waters and especially wetlands in their interpretation of WOTUS. So when that happened, the Biden administration released a tweak to its WOTUS definition to try and address that. And then when the Trump administration came in, they essentially said they wanted to roll that back a bit further, or at least, revisit it. So the EPA released its proposal on November 20th for its new WOTUS definition. The comment period appears to have ended on January 5th. We're still waiting to see the exact final language that the EPA will use, but certainly pending, and I'm sure they're reviewing those comments now. But yeah, so typically when the definition of WOTUS gets restricted, that means less regulation that landfill operators in particular have to worry about. You might see an operator need to dredge a creek bed, and it might be if it doesn't have water flowing through it continuously, then that might mean that they don't have to worry about federal restrictions on dredging a creek bed. If there is, maybe, but it depends on the definition of WOTUS. So things like that are affected by the definition that we see. The other thing to keep in mind with landfills when it comes to federal regulations, again, they are regulated under the Clean Air Act, but not based on the greenhouse gas emissions that they emit. Instead, landfills are regulated based on non-methane organic compounds, which tends to include things that might cause odor, which is what has drawn attention to them in the first place when it comes to federal air regulations. So the EPA is overdue to release new source performance standards and emissions guidelines for municipal solid waste landfills. Those are the guidelines that affect new and existing landfills. We might see them release those, or at least a proposal this year. It's TBD, but again, at some point they have to, under the law, at least take a look at their air regulations for municipal solid waste landfills. So we'll keep an eye out for those.
Gotcha. Yeah, and as reference to the comments here, we are seeing more states move in their own direction, in terms of maybe stricter landfill emissions regulations or different monitoring approaches. So that's a trend to watch there as well.
Definitely.
We're going to have one more for you, Jacob, on the greenhouse gas emission side. And anyone watching, if you have questions on greenhouse gas emissions or anything we've been talking about, please feel free to put it in the chat. The final one on this before we pivot to PFAS would be food waste, right? We know that is a lot of what is emitting the greenhouse gas emissions from landfills. What, Jacob, are we seeing at the federal level in terms of the EPA's approach to composting and anaerobic digestion infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an interesting one where, as you mentioned, food waste is responsible for something like 58% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we see from landfills. So, pretty significant portion there. And under the Biden administration, the EPA was focused on food waste as a means of addressing those, climate change pollutants. But action actually continues on food waste under the Trump administration, at least in some forms. The EPA announced this Feed It Onward initiative designed to essentially reroute food that could still be edible to families that need it. It had an example of a program like that on an Air Force base that it, said was part of this new initiative. And it also appears that we'll still see some grant funding for composting and especially anaerobic digestion. That also gets a little bit into the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which oversees some programs that provide funding for those kinds of facilities. Things have gotten a little bit wonky there. The USDA announced a pause in January on funding for new anaerobic digester projects. Essentially, they were taking a look at the finances of those kinds of projects, and whether the USDA should be involved in providing loans to them, or if they would not be able to recover the costs. So that pause, I think, is due to expire soon. So we'll see what happens there. But if you look ahead into things like, the Farm Bill, there appears to be still plenty of appetite for that program that would fund digesters and compost. So, we'll expect to see more on that in the future.
Gotcha. Yeah, food waste is a relatively bipartisan issue versus some of the other things we've been talking about. Depends on how it's talked about, of course. But and on the packaging side, we're even seeing the possibility that food date labeling could get standardized, the language there. Some folks see a role there to have more standard date labeling to reduce food waste, but nothing's moved yet. We're going to pivot to PFAS. That said, if folks do have questions that come up on greenhouse gas emissions or anything we've talked about, please feel free to put them in the Q&A and we can get to them at the end. Megan, this section is more for you. We know a big piece of the PFAS issue, and I should back up, PFAS is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances known as forever chemicals. It's in many things that, nonstick pans, textiles, firefighting foam, it's in a lot of stuff, has ended up in landfills, right? Comes out in their leachate. Under the Biden administration, new regulations were put in place about PFAS levels in drinking water, as well as designating PFAS as a hazardous substance under CERCLA. There's a lot to unpack there, but what has changed under the second Trump administration in terms of how they're approaching those two determinations, and what does it mean for waste operators?
Yeah, so I'll take these one at a time because there's two kind of overarching regulatory aspects to how EPA is managing PFAS currently. The first one you mentioned under CERCLA, excuse me, that's just the name of the regulation under which these two specific PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, were determined to be hazardous substances. Where the waste and recycling industry comes into this is, just as a refresher, some folks in the industry really felt like that determination set them up for liability issues, really potentially costly liability issues. And the idea there is that, hey, we're like a landfill or a recycling facility. We take in PFAS-containing materials that we have no control over, so we should have a carve out from this CERCLA designation. And in 2024, actually, the National Waste and Recycling Association and some other groups actually sued EPA for that reason. And this has been going on for a couple of years now. That case is, still moving through the court system. But the EPA, kind of as it's working through that, has said that they do intend to develop some new rules about how other substances could be designated under CERCLA. So not just PFAS, but like whatever else might come up under this designation, to sort of just reframe how the EPA kind of works through these regulations. But the EPA has said that they are going to defend in court their claim that PFAS and these two PFAS should be hazardous substances, which was kind of a surprise because the Trump administration has kind of taken a 180 on a lot of decisions that were made under the Biden administration. So that was one where they were like, no, I think those two should still be CERCLA hazardous substances. So that's still kind of moving through the process. There's potentially pretty clear impacts for the waste and recycling industry, depending on how that shakes out. And we can talk a little bit later about some of the non-EPA aspects of how like Congress and stuff is going to potentially try to address this issue in a different way. So that's the CERCLA side. Meanwhile, we also have drinking water standards. So under the Biden administration, again, as a refresher, there were 6 specific PFAS that the Biden administration listed as having legally enforceable drinking water limits. This was a huge deal because that hadn't previously been a regulation for these specific PFAS. Though under the Trump administration, they decided they were actually going to roll back the majority of that drinking water standard. But they were going to try to keep two PFAS, those same PFAS that are CERCLA hazardous substances, under that drinking water regulation. So that's also in court because the some water utilities did sue over that sort of update. And yeah, that's still also moving through the court system. And the EPA has tried to just delay a lot of court actions under that one because they have said like, hey, we're gonna be working on some other drinking water issues, and give us some time to sort of work some stuff out on our end, and we'll see what happens with that. But another big thing that the EPA is working on related to these drinking water regulations is last year they said that they were going to actually extend some of the compliance timelines for the entities that need to comply with these two drinking water regulations. So that's not finalized as far as I know yet, but the idea would be the compliance timelines would get extended out to 2031 for some of these. So whatever timelines we're working with, those are expected to be extended. The idea of even regulating some of these PFAS is still moving through the court system. So the reason that the waste and recycling industry cares about drinking water standards is because they have leachate that comes out of their landfills that goes to water treatment facilities. So there's some idea of like how that might affect, when that material moves through water treatment facilities. So and we can talk a little bit later about some of the water treatment carve-outs as well. But those are the two big regulatory things that have been happening for the last couple of years, and we're really trying to just see what's going to happen in terms of some of the like legal battles, and then just how EPA is going to regulate other types of materials in the future based on how this has been shaking out with PFAS specifically.
Gotcha. It's a lot to follow there. And it's complicated, right? For not just for anyone trying to pay attention, especially for landfill operators trying to figure out where the regs are, what standards do they need to meet. As Megan said, they largely are expected to meet the drinking water standards when it comes to PFAS and leachate. There's a whole world of treatment technologies cropping up for that. Sticking with kind of the cost and liability side, and then we'll talk in a minute more about the management of this material. Megan, could you speak more about what you referenced with Congress, right? Congress seems possibly interested in playing a role here, trying to designate landfills as passive receivers, which the EPA has loosely said they agree with that position, but we of course know the industry and the operators would like to see that in firmer terms.
Yeah, so the reason that Congress is involved in all is partially because, the industry has said like, hey, we really want more clarity. The EPA has said like, sure, like, yeah, you guys, we don't mean you guys when we talk about CERCLA, like you guys are fine, but there's nothing really specifically in the regulations. That's the opinion that some people in the waste industry have. They're like, we need it in writing, please. So Congress, there's a couple bills that we've seen in the last couple years at the federal level that try to get at that, sort of like really having clear language saying there is a carve out for these specific industries. Right now, there isn't one that I know of. If you are out there and you know that there's going to be a bill introduced soon that gets to this, please reach out to me. But there was a congressional bill in 2025 that would have sought to have a carve out for some of these drinking water water treatment facilities. And the waste industry has been asking for a similar type of bill to be passed. Like in the US, at the federal level, bills get introduced, and because of all the stuff that is happening in our country, sometimes that's not as much of a priority to move those forward. So it's not something that would be a fast fix. It is something that Congress is looking at. And just in general, taking a step back, in the last couple of years, we have seen Congress pay more attention to PFAS regulations and how those affect industries. We've seen a lot more, like hearings in Congress where lawmakers are talking to the industry directly about how this is affecting their business. So from a business perspective, especially because the EPA is taking more of a business focus now, it is notable just to see that those conversations are happening at the federal level. So while we may not have a specific bill that's getting passed right now or a specific regulation that we're seeing really get to the heart of this, those conversations are happening specifically. So that's just something to note. And yeah, again, shameless plug. If you work in the waste industry and PFAS is affecting your business, please reach out to me because we would love to hear how that is happening, what that looks like for you. Um, and yeah, let us know. So.
Yeah, we're always glad to talk to folks about this. Yeah, and for our international audience that may be less familiar with the U.S. legislative process, the current Congress runs until the beginning of January of next year. And we have midterm elections in the fall, which possibly could change control of one or both chambers of Congress and further change the landscape and would restart the clock. New legislation would have to be introduced next year. So stay tuned on that one. Um, One more for you on this, Megan. We've talked more about the kind of the cost, the liability piece. There's the other angle. The U.S. government itself has a cost and liability piece through the Department of Defense, or as the new administration prefers to call it, the Department of War. They have a lot of PFAS waste from firefighting foam and other uses that they are on the hook to clean up. And so we see an angle from the DoD talking about preferences for PFAS cleanup, which in turn is a signal to the waste industry for how they could offer this service to customers. And the DoD recently put out updated guidance just earlier this year. Can you tell us what changed there and what they recommend for managing this?
Yeah, so the Department of Defense is on the hook to clean up about 700 military sites that have PFAS contamination. A lot of this contamination is from firefighting foam. And at a certain point, they had a moratorium on incineration for this material, but that's since kind of sunsetted. So um, the DoD recently, yes, like you said, put out a document just kind of giving their thinking on how they want to manage this material based on the available science and based on just what's available and able to be used in the US right now. So they were leaning a little bit more towards hazardous waste landfills just because of the nature of how hazardous waste landfills are regulated, how they're set up, and just how available they are around the country. And incineration is another option that the DoD feels comfortable recommending as an option as well. A lot of that is because of some of the research that has been coming out in the last couple of years in conjunction with the EPA and private industries about how effective those strategies actually are. And maybe Jacob can talk a little bit more about that. But some companies that we cover often offer those services. So that's really relevant because once you start seeing something like the DoD say, hey, yeah, we think these are good methods for getting rid of PFAS, managing PFAS, destroying PFAS, and you happen to have a business that does that. And adds a lot of credibility to your business, and that's something that we see as a business driver or a potential business driver. Another interesting thing to note about DoD's recent guidance is that they specifically said, hey, EPA also has guidance about destruction and disposal of PFAS in certain ways. And we actually looked at their notes and we took notes of our own based on their recommendations. So the EPA has said that they want to continue monitoring the available research on destruction and disposal of PFAS and update those guidelines more often based on that research. So we also see potential for more business because of that as well. So, but yeah, the DoD is they're warming a little bit more to the hazardous waste landfills and incineration as options. They don't want to be putting this stuff in solid waste landfills just because of the regulatory aspects and also the potential for, leachate management, maybe it going into the air, things like that. So yeah, that just kind of gives us a broad picture, but there's more to drill down on that.
Yeah, no, and as Megan said, both the DoD and EPA guidance offers different solutions for how to manage this. There's a whole kind of middle step of treatment technologies as well, which we won't get into in detail here, but have covered as well. Different ways to treat this, but even with those processes, excuse me, there's still a final disposal solution needed, for what's filtered out or captured there. And it is these hazardous waste landfills or incinerators, in some cases, deep well injection, but there's not that many of those sites. Jacob, as Megan hinted, hazardous waste incineration is coming back into favor as a PFAS management option. There had been a brief moratorium on it at the DoD. That's off now. Tell us a little more, please, about what we saw last year with some companies working with the EPA to prove effectiveness down to many decimal points. What did that look like?
Yeah, so we're getting onto the bleeding edge of PFAS research here. So there were two companies that reported successful results from incinerating PFAS contaminated materials at their hazardous waste incinerators. It was Veolia and Clean Harbors. And they each used this test method. It's called OTM-50 that the federal government has put forth as a potential way to measure the destruction of these PFAS chemicals. Just to dig into the science a little bit, when something's an OTM or other test method, that means that it's essentially a technique that the EPA thinks could work successfully to measure, in this case, the presence of PFAS chemicals, but it hasn't gone through like a formal rulemaking process. So they're saying like, according to the best available science, this is how we can look for these things. But the science is continuing to evolve, and we're actually continuing to find ways to measure more kinds of PFAS chemicals through the incineration process. There's thousands of these chemicals. We can measure, I think, about 100 at the most in the incineration process. So obviously a lot of unknowns that we're slowly uncovering. But as we mentioned, there were two successful tests last year. Where Veolia first in May, they released the results of a test and found that they could achieve up to 99.9999, that's four nines after the decimal point, percent destruction of certain PFAS compounds in their test. And then Clean Harbors did a similar test, and they collaborated with the EPA on their test and reported the same basically strong results of the four nines success. So yeah, and like Cole mentioned, the federal government has been back and forth on incineration of PFAS contaminated materials. But it's more positive these days. Those tests seem to indicate that this is a viable method of treating, or at least solving some of the contamination in these materials. And these companies are, certainly advertising their services and anticipating significant growth in the PFAS treatment business because they've gotten that sort of success in their collaboration with the federal government. So.
Thank you. And yes, when you hear folks talking about how many nines there are in their research, the point of pride, how many nines of destruction you can ensure in the decimal points. We have a question in the chat, and thank you for that. The question is, battery fires are a significant challenge in the waste industry. Could limiting PFAS and firefighting foam hinder that? It's a good question. I can take that a bit from our manufacturing dive side, where we do cover production of PFAS and production of some of these materials. 3M, a major producer of PFAS over the years, has actually shifted to a fluorine-free foam. I will not say I'm an expert on this, but one of our other reporters, Sarah Samora, follows more closely, but they have been shifting production of that, and even recently announced an acquisition of a fire safety company to kind of lean into a different aspect of that work. And we've also seen a lot of legislation at the state level trying to limit AFFF, aqueous film forming foam, that contains PFAS. And so folks are seeing that there is a way to still manage these fires without this particular type of material. That said, at the DoD level, they are still using it in some cases. Different versions of the annual defense funding bill had phase-out timelines and said you got to stop using it by a certain date. The most recent one that was signed at the end of last year extended that timeline till later this year. So theoretically, DoD can still use AFFF, and will continue to have a waste factor to deal with there. But later in the year, unless they extend it again, which is very possible, they will have to shift to an alternative. So it's something to watch, and it's an interesting question that we could dig into more. But kind of what do those fluorine-free foams look like? But they are on the market. So it's but at the same time, still plenty of the old stuff to clean up as well. Going back to you, Jacob, for one on a different aspect of PFAS, as Megan mentioned, a lot of this material is a big concern at wastewater treatment plants, right? Both in terms of coming in through water systems as well as leachate from landfills and everything in between, results in biosolids, or sometimes referred to as sewage sludge, which contains PFAS. And in some cases, could be applied to the land for farming uses, but there's health concerns there. What has or has not been happening at the federal level when it comes to regulating PFAS and biosolids?
Right. Yeah. So the EPA has been kind of quiet on biosolids as of late. So in January 2025, right before Trump took office, the EPA released a draft risk assessment of PFAS and biosolids. They found that it could, sorry, the PFAS contamination in biosolids could potentially be harmful to health for the farmers that are applying this material at a certain concentration level. That is a draft. And so the EPA still at some point is likely to finalize that. But we're not quite sure what's going to happen. So last year, Congress actually tried to block the EPA from finalizing that risk assessment. That effort was ultimately squashed, but we haven't heard much from the EPA since. And in the absence of federal regulation, we've started to see states take their own measures to try and address this stuff. Maine was the first state to ban the land application of biosolids. It's, putting the biosolids on farmland, essentially to use as a fertilizer. Connecticut has now also banned it. So there's two states that ban land application. And there are several other states that have various limits around the use of biosolids as fertilizer now because they're concerned about that PFAS contamination. So we'll likely see more action on that, as things continue to progress and as our understanding grows. But there's also lawsuits, to try and compel EPA to regulate the presence of PFAS and biosolids. The EPA actually is required to review contaminants of concern in biosolids around the country and every couple of years report back on what it's found. It does that for, I believe, 9 chemicals right now. And I should say it limits 9 chemicals as part of that review, but it monitors and is aware of a lot more. There's more than a dozen PFAS chemicals that it has said is aware is in biosolids, but isn't necessarily regulating at this time. A lawsuit is trying to compel the EPA to do that. It got sent to appeals court at the end of last year. And more recently, there's a brief filed in that lawsuit, essentially arguing that EPA has to regulate PFAS and biosolids because some states won't, create regulations that go beyond the federal minimum when it comes to the Clean Water Act. So essentially, if EPA doesn't regulate PFAS and biosolids, some states won't. And that has some communities concerned. But of course, again, as we've talked about, handling this material is difficult. Nobody wants to have to be liable for the PFAS contamination, especially if it occurs upstream of, these waste facilities or wastewater treatment plants. So there are certainly efforts to try and ensure that that liability doesn't fall on these facilities. But again, certainly biosolids have become kind of like a hot potato in this debate, and still an ongoing debate.
Yeah, and as Jacob said, we're seeing a lot of that play out at the state level. Plenty more to come in the years ahead. I just put in the chat as well what I referenced on the manufacturing dev side, with many states passing or considering laws to limit PFAS in certain products, including firefighting foam. Quite a bit more to come on that as well, even though theoretically it's not being put into products. It turns out it still is in a lot of things, and there's a long road to kind of phase that out of many products. Megan, we're going to go back to you for one more on PFAS. As we didn't talk about it in that much detail here today, but as folks have probably followed in the last year, there have been a lot of staffing changes at the EPA broadly, certain offices being closed, layoffs occurring. What has that meant when it comes to PFAS research and where that may fall in the EPA?
Yeah, so the main research office that was specifically dedicated to a lot of these research projects did close. What I was hearing from some EPA employees was that a lot of that research is still happening. They're just in different departments. It's unclear how that's working and sort of what projects might be impacted by just these larger reorganization aspects that have been happening at the EPA because it's not just that the research department is absorbed into other departments. Every department has kind of changed around in some way. So at least back in December, I was having conversations with folks who worked at EPA just about how they're, adjusting to that. But some of that work is still happening. And a lot of these employees are also career employees that have gone through a lot of different administrations. So on one end, we're hearing some of this work is still happening. On the other end, it's unclear sort of like what the new priorities are, if some of these PFAS research priorities have shifted, and sort of what timelines are for some of these things. Again, like I had mentioned earlier, EPA had said that they want to publish the updated destruction disposal guidelines for PFAS more often. And to do that, they need to put time and resources into doing those updates. And another aspect that might have some effect is that John Bustrud, who was the previous head of the Maine Waste Office at the EPA, has left for health reasons, and there's a new acting administrator of that department. The reason that I bring that up, that's a different department than what this research department was, but John Bustrud had said when he took this part of the office that he saw PFAS research and management as a big priority for the EPA. So it'll be interesting to see if that has any effect once we see what the new leadership looks like as well. So those are some things that are, there's not a ton of clarity, but EPA at large has said that PFAS is a priority. So how that will affect some of the long-term research has yet to be seen.
Can I add a
Sure.
couple of things on the
Please.
present situation in the EPA? Okay, so two
Yeah.
things. One is so staffing levels at the EPA are the lowest they've been in 40 years, like since the 80s.
Right.
We saw, I believe it was over 1,000 federal workers leave the EPA last year. It's a little bit difficult to know, on like an office by office level, like, was it mostly researchers? Was it mostly folks working on like the enforcement side? Don't quite have that level of visibility yet. But certainly, you could expect that might slow some functions down as a result. The other just historical note is that Lee Zeldin, who is now administrator of the EPA, when he was a congressman in New York, he had actually been paying attention to PFAS issues. And so it's kind of a question when he was nominated and confirmed to lead the EPA is he going to be potentially not as is he going to, take an axe to PFAS regulations, or is he going to take a more measured approach, because he was open to some forms of regulations of PFAS? So yeah, just two things to keep in mind when we're thinking about how the EPA is operating today.
It's helpful context. Yeah, definitely a big staff change there, including many folks who had previously worked in the solid waste industry who joined EPA under the Biden administration. That came and went quickly. And as Megan noted, right, we're waiting to see new leadership in the Office of Land and Emergency Management after the prior assistant administrator resigns for personal reasons. There's an acting person, but not a nominated person yet for Senate confirmation. So we'll see where that goes. Final reminder for any questions to come in. Thank you as well for the comments from folks that have been coming. Helpful comment from Maine here about the biosolids landfill capacity issue up there. Yes, we have certainly been following that and are always glad to talk more if anyone has perspective. Question on the Circle Act, which to my knowledge is more focused on recycling, like packaging recycling infrastructure, which we'll definitely talk about in the June webinar. I'm not aware of a connection here, but it's worth us checking out to see. We're going to pivot back to a non-PFAS question, more on the greenhouse gas emission side, just since we do have a few minutes. Jacob, you cover the biogas world quite a bit in terms of capturing value out of landfill emissions and anaerobic digesters. What does the new renewable fuel standard update from the EPA mean for waste operators?
Right. Yeah. So this literally just got finalized on Friday. So I'm still reading the fine print of it, but what we can say is that the EPA decided to be a little more supportive of the biogas industry than it had initially proposed last year. So just to reset, the renewable fuel standard creates this credit market for alternative fuels. It's considered to be a way to boost production of things like ethanol, but also fuels derived from biogas, like renewable natural gas or biomethane, as it's sometimes called, which you can create from landfill gas. You do have to upgrade the landfill gas in order to make it pipeline quality RNG and get the credits, but that's kind of how it works. RFS update, it sets the level of they're called renewable volume obligations, but it's basically how many credits the producers of petroleum-based fuels have to buy in order to be in compliance. And basically, like the higher the RVO targets, the more of a boost it will be to the alternative fuels. So the EPA set a certain level that it proposed for the next few years in its proposal over the summer. The biogas industry said, you're not setting it high enough. We believe the industry can produce a lot more fuel to meet the demand than what you're assuming. And so the EPA took those comments, reviewed them, and essentially decided, yeah, we'll give you it's basically a 2 to 3% higher, renewable volume obligation target than what they had initially proposed, but still, modestly better for the biogas industry and for, those landfills that are refining their landfill gas into RNG. There were some other things that the EPA did with its new RFS rules. Starting in 2028, they want to cut in half the amount of credits that fuel produced outside of the United States can receive from the renewable fuel standard. So that could affect some companies that have, say, a landfill operating in Canada, but want to, sell credits produced from their RNG there into the U.S. transportation fuel market, which they can do. But yeah, they might suddenly find that they can get half as many credits as they were expecting previously. So that affects some of the larger waste companies. There are also some other things like the EPA at one point had considered allowing credits for energy used as, transportation fuel. So essentially, like if you had a landfill and you took your landfill gas and produced electricity from it, there was this proposal of like, hey, maybe you can still generate credits under the renewable fuel standard and get a subsidy that way. That was never finalized. It was just always in the language as a proposed thing. And the latest update to the RFS has essentially removed that language. So we will not expect that kind of credit in the near term. So again, a modest improvement in terms of what the biogas industry was expecting to see in the renewable fuel standard, and still a program that will support the development of RNG. Not as exciting as the biogas industry may have wanted, but still there. So yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, definitely very wonky, but very relevant for the waste industry in terms of how they manage their methane emissions and opportunities for the business there. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm just going to turn it back to you, Megan and Jacob. Megan, we'll start with you. Anything else folks should be watching? Anything you're watching the rest of the year on the topics we discussed today?
Yeah, from the PFAS perspective, aside from just monitoring some of these court cases to see how that's going, and also just monitoring how EPA in general prioritizes some of these PFAS management priorities. I think an interesting aspect that's less of a federal impact and more just a business impact is how companies are investing in PFAS technology. Because the reason I bring this up in a federal context is because a few years ago, we were seeing a lot of these companies, waste and recycling companies, say like, yeah, we're gonna wait and see what the regulations shake out to be. It might be a big investment. And now, like a lot of the major companies, they already have PFAS management systems of some kind. They're investing in PFAS management and mitigation aspects. So these things are already happening compared to a couple of years ago when we were still sort of like waiting on these EPA regulations. So I think I'm personally just interested to see the evolution of how companies are spending their money on PFAS and PFAS management in the future.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely interesting to see how quickly those technologies have evolved and how we're seeing some of these companies talk about it as a business opportunity to help others manage their PFAS waste, despite the cost they may have for managing their own. Jacob, on your side, anything else to watch this year when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, good question. I think so much of what's happening when it comes to, climate related regulations is contingent. So like the endangerment finding repealed, that's been challenged in court. What we're seeing with greenhouse gas reporting program, also court challenges, and again, like deadlines that have extended. So much of what's happening there is subject to how the courts ultimately rule. So we'll see what happens there. It's something that I will continue to follow throughout the year. And then, like I said, there are still more regulations that we can expect, or I guess we'll wait and see what happens. We're still waiting for WOTUS to get finalized. We'll see what happens with these new incineration rules regarding disaster debris, tires, things like that. Certainly more to come, but we'll wait and see what happens.
All right. Well, I'll put the link in the chat here for anyone who's watching who maybe hasn't already signed up. This is where you can find our newsletter. It is a free daily newsletter, Monday through Friday, and share it with your friends as well to keep apprised of all these things happening. And stay tuned again for our June 16th webinar, where we'll be back talking about federal and state recycling policy. And thank you very much, Sweta, for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Megan. And thank you, Jacob. So we already have the sign-up links from Waste Dive and email from Waste Dive team as well. So please reach out to people in case you want to. And thank you for attending the webinar. We will see you again in June. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.